Do you know what? I'm from America, and we're having a couple problems right now. Some of them have to do with our values. We've talked a little bit about values today. Some of them have to do with, I don't know, science and how important science might be to our collective future. And some of them have to do with telling the truth and how important that might be to, I don't know, governance. And so many of us in the United States, and I think that probably other people around the world might be having some checks in with themselves about where things are going. And we're really reflecting a lot on the nature of what is true. And every day I get up and I go to work, and I work at this great company. It's called Bionic. And at Bionic, we do awesome things with the world's largest companies. And the thing is that these companies are also struggling to accept some very, very difficult truths. They're very big, and like America, they're strong. And like America, they've been kind of dominant for a really long time. And so maybe we're all a little bit, complacent, a little bit smug. And we think that maybe we're doing okay. But our largest companies actually have some really profound existential challenges. Startups are coming from nowhere and crushing them. They're not growing. They can go from this big to a little bit bigger, but they can't build something new from nothing. And so this year, the company that I work for wrote this book. It's authored by David Kidder, but I also want to give a shout out to his co-author, Christina Wallace, who is getting married today. So I am not actually at her wedding, and I regret that. But I love you, Christina. Congratulations. And this book is really about kind of introducing some of these very large companies to some of the very difficult truths that they must face in order to start being able to grow again, to grow like startups. So our promise is about growing like startups and investing like VCs and all of that. So today, we're here to talk about product leadership, and I'm definitely going to do that. But this year, all of my customers and my nation and myself personally are really deeply reflecting about truth. And so it's in this frame of mind that I'm looking at my toolkit to figure out what tools can I bring to you, as a gift. Hopefully it's a welcome one and not like the icky sweater that you get at Christmas that you have to regift to somebody. But that's what I'm here to do. I've identified 3 tools that I think are super, super powerful, that have helped me personally to be a better person, to get through this challenging time. We've heard a lot about resilience today. So these are my tools that I use to get to the heart of what is true and to be more effective at work. Because that's what we all want to be, is effective, right? We want to come in, we want to do our jobs, we want to have an impact, we want to work with other people who want to have an impact so that we all kind of are effective together, and that's profoundly satisfying. That's inherent in the nature of flow, if that's an idea that you're familiar with, flow. We all get into a state of flow when we're doing work that is hard, but we're effective at it. So I want us all to be a little bit more effective at work. So to introduce these 3 tools, naming the tools would be kind of boring, so I thought I would give you some really provocative statements. So you can dislike these if you want, but that's okay. The first one I think is kind of funny because it's, I don't know, nihilistic or something. Like, the path out of hell leads through misery. This isn't my statement. This is actually a quote from a very prominent psychologist that we'll talk about in just a moment. The second provocative statement that we'll be talking about is that business decisions are often made illogically. And I might actually say that because decisions are made by humans, it's not just business decisions that are made illogically, and it's not just that they're often made illogically, it's that decisions are made illogically, kind of most of the time. And the third provocative statement is that one does not get buy-in during a meeting. So buy-in is a phrase that we all use a lot, right? We all know what buy-in is. Yeah, I don't know, what is it? Someday someone's going to define it in a way that actually holds true. So let's start with the first one, this lovely statement. This is the woman here. Her name is Marsha Linehan. So Marsha Linehan started researching borderline personality disorder. I'm not saying that any of you have borderline. I'm just but probably you've encountered somebody, you just didn't know it. It's possible that my president has it. I'm sorry if I'm offending someone, but I just can't hide from the politics. So Marsha Linehan in 1968 started researching this phenomenon of borderline, and what came out of that research over the course of the next 4 decades is this amazing body of very practical, tactical techniques for doing all sorts of things. And one of the things that came out of that research is this idea of radical acceptance. So we've heard about radical candor. Kim Scott out of Google worked for that woman who's now COO, Sheryl Sandberg, right? Kim Scott worked for Sheryl Sandberg, and they were walking down a pathway on the Google campus one day, and Sheryl was like, gosh, Kim, you were super ineffective in that meeting. And Kim was like, ow, that hurts, but thank you. And she reflected on that set of experiences, and she wrote this book, Radical Candor. Radical Candor is about giving truth with love for the benefit of another person. It's a management technique. If you're not familiar with it, it's something that you really should look into because it's super important and super effective, that we can be very direct with people when we really care about them. Well, what Marsha Linehan did, not knowing about Kim Scott and decades earlier, is she came upon the same kind of concept, but she applied it to oneself. So radical acceptance is the same idea. It is truth with care, but it's for the benefit of ourselves. So Kim Scott says, here's a great way to manage other people. You tell them the unvarnished truth, but you do it with love so that they get healthier. Why shouldn't we do that with ourselves? Why shouldn't I look in the mirror and go dude, Janice, what's the truth? Let's admit that for real. Also, you're kind of cool. So when we think about accepting the truth at work, we have to say, well, what kinds of truth do we need to accept at work? Okay, so let's say I didn't get a raise. What if I didn't get a raise? That would be a painful truth. I'd be like, God damn it, I didn't get a raise. I wanted a raise, and when I asked for a raise, right? So that's the kind of truth we have to accept at work. You might also have to accept the truth that maybe you have a lot of responsibility but no authority, right? That happens a lot. Maybe you have to accept the truth that your customers aren't buying your product. Maybe you have to accept the truth that a new competitor is beating you. There are lots and lots and lots of really unpleasant truths that we have to accept at work. So here's a moment. I want you to reflect yourself. Just take a quiet moment. How often do you complain about work? How often do you leave work just exhausted? When were you angry last at work? I literally complained about work this morning. I bet some of you complained about work sometime today to somebody that you were chatting with at the conference. And wouldn't it be nice to have some relief? Instead of feeling like we needed to complain, what if we just felt a little like, yeah, that thing happened, no biggie, water off a duck's back. That's what we're talking about with radical acceptance. So I want to get really specific here. All right, so I asked you to take a moment and reflect. Now take a moment and reflect on a specific decision, a business decision, sometime in the last year that was really, really disappointing to you. So just hold on to that. We're going to use it as a little case example, little thought experiment. So one business decision that was disappointing. Now consider the impact of that decision. Who are all the people that were affected by that decision? What would have been a better call? Did the person who made that decision talk to you about it? Who did they talk to about it? Just think about those questions. And now I want you to notice how your body is feeling. So when I was rehearsing this talk, I actually did that exercise in my own head. I thought about a decision. And I found my heart beating faster and my palms got a little sweaty. Maybe there's a little lump in your throat. And if you're actually feeling those physical symptoms, which are totally human, those physical symptoms, that means you're still kind of not at peace with the facts of that situation. You're still carrying that burden. Wouldn't it be nice to feel some relief from that? And what's true is that all of those thoughts, all of that frustration that we complain about, all of those physical symptoms, that's actually work that our brain is doing. That's a drain on our neurological capacity. So it impedes our ability to be effective at work because the brain, even without our awareness, is busy working in the background to rationalize some kind of dissonance between the way we think the world should be and the way the world is. So this mental dissonance is what Marsha Linehan was trying to resolve. She was trying to give us a tool that would help us to feel more peace, even when things are kind of going not the way we want them to, which I don't know about you, but I'm finding as an American that that is very timely and relevant exercise. What she says, her words, I love it. She says, radical acceptance is when you stop fighting reality and stop throwing tantrums because reality is not the way you want it. And I've never thought of myself as someone who throws tantrums. Maybe my coworkers think differently. So what do we typically do when the world is not the way we want it? We, persevere, we power through it. Like, I am a monster of just powering through really unpleasant stuff. And I understand that that's, one of the cliche, stiff upper lip behaviors of British people. So, yeah, we're all good at this. We have practice. And instead, what Marsha Linehan says is that actually it's possible simply by virtue of answering a couple of questions yourself or with a partner, you can actually get past it. So instead of complaining for an hour over drinks with a coworker, what if you sat down with yourself and a pad of paper and answered 6 quick questions? And I actually do this. I do this by going to a cafe. It's a place that I like. They play good music. I drink an iced tea. And I write. And I answer these questions. What is the situation? How did it happen? What effect did it have on me in various ways? How did I contribute? So now I'm turning the lens on myself. How did other people contribute? So what's my responsibility? What's their responsibility? And what did I have control over in the situation? And often what I find is when I do this examination, I find that what I'm struggling against are things that I had no control over in the first place. So the truth that I'm accepting, in part, is that I'm a little bit powerless over certain aspects of the situation, and so I couldn't do anything about it. So I'm kind of, what do they say, spitting into the wind? I'm kind of like, I'm like Sisyphus trying to roll the boulder up the hill, and it's coming back down again. So I can just, let it go, because there's literally nothing I can do about it. So I think of this as a retro. So some of us work in Agile software. I'm a big fan of a lot of the Agile practices. One of the practices I like best in order to teach myself things is the retrospective. This is the Radical Acceptance 6-question retro. Do it in 1 hour, either by yourself or with a friend and a whiteboard. And what you see coming out the other side is that all of that frustration sort of dissipates. It just, like, oh, now I've rationally told myself the truth. Now I can see the truth. Now I can move on. It stops controlling your thoughts and your emotions. Once it stops controlling your emotions, you have 3 choices, and there are only 3 choices. I mean, you could continue to suffer by not looking the truth in the face, or you can solve the problem. Let's say I have some control over it. Let's say we're in that I want a raise situation. Okay, so I want a raise. I didn't get a raise. I've examined how and why that happened. I now know exactly what I can do because I've looked at what control I have over that situation. So it's like, okay, I go, I ask for my development path, we set a time frame for my development path, right? I can take positive action into the future. So the retrospective is about what is true today and what was true before, just the facts. This step is about, now what can I do moving forward? The second thing you can do is feel better about it. You know what? I didn't get that raise, but it also turns out that they really respect me, and they told me these things, right? And now I know how to move forward. So I can reframe the whole thing around some facts rather than around a lot of imaginings because I hadn't had the disciplined thinking. And then the third thing is, let's say I didn't get the raise, and it turns out I didn't like the reason I didn't get the raise. But now I know that that's where I am, and I can accept it. I can just say like, okay, I'm not gonna quit. I like this job. Let's keep going. But I'm doing it consciously, and by putting it into my conscious mind rather than letting it ruminate in my unconscious mind, I'm now not controlled by it any longer. So this tool of radical acceptance, while it was developed for some extreme mental illness type situations, actually turns out to be a very, very practical tool that maps exactly to two of the most powerful tools that we've had in modern software management, right? Radical candor and a retrospective. So we can tell ourselves the truth and not be controlled by it. So that's your first tool. I've already talked about all of these things. These slides are, by the way, already online at CleverGirl, or at slideshare.net/CleverGirl. So a couple final thoughts about this radical acceptance piece. We need to just admit that rejecting reality doesn't change it. Donald Trump is President of the United States. I don't say that very often, but he is. In order to change reality, we must first accept it. It turns out that half of the voting public of the United States voted for him. That's real. Okay, now I have some ideas about what I might do to change my own point of view. The thing about accepting it is that it can be really painful. Like, I really, really don't like some of the things that I've had to accept in the last year. It can be painful, and that pain, you can't avoid it. You just cram it in the back of your head, it's going to control you. So you have to go through that pain, but going through that pain and accepting reality, even if it's icky, turns out that leads to a real calm, real centeredness, so that you can move forward effectively. And that's why Marsha Linehan says that the path out of hell leads through misery. In order to really kind of give some current, contemporary, modern pop, management theory to this, I pulled out this quote from Angela Duckworth's Grit. If you haven't read it, it's a really good read. It's about, this idea of perseverance and really kind of being able to be gritty like an entrepreneur. And she says that it isn't suffering that leads to hopelessness, it's suffering you think you can't control. So that's what Marsha Linehan has been trying to get people to accept, is that by looking at reality straight in the face, you can move through it. It's okay. You can cope with it. Okay. So here's our second tool. The provocative statement that I brought out for this is that business decisions are often made illogically, and we've already established that all decisions are usually made illogically because humans what? Humans are biased, and we're fallible. And I found this quote by Tolstoy when he was a young, good-looking guy rather than the bearded guy that looks like he just crawled out from under a rock. And here's what he said. I think this is really eloquent. Most men and women, including those at ease with problems of the greatest complexity, like my fellow speakers today, can seldom accept even the simplest and most obvious truth, if it be such as would oblige them to admit the falsity of conclusions which they have delighted in explaining to colleagues, which they have proudly taught to others, and which they have woven thread by thread into the fabric of their lives. Okay, I think Tolstoy was talking to us for today. So, people are biased. People have to make decisions. I believe that any decision should have at least 3 people involved: the person who can say yes to the answer, the person who has to live with the outcome, and the person who maybe has the subject matter expertise. So let's just imagine an ideal world that all 3 people are involved in the decision making. Each one of them comes in with their own biases. Oh my gosh, what a nest of difficulty. So raise your hand if you've learned about cognitive biases in the past. All of us, right? Thank you, Cindy Alvarez. She gave an awesome talk at Mind the Product, applying cognitive bias to user research back in August in San Francisco. But really, the number of biases, she gave us like 4 or 5 biases that we could mitigate through specific kinds of questioning. But when we're talking about all of the decisions that happen at work every day, the number of cognitive biases at play is just massive. There's no way I could teach you about any of those. And frankly, I've had 2 cognitive bias trainings just this year. And yet, I don't see cognitive biases actually coming into play in how we help each other make decisions. I don't know how actionable any of these trainings really are, with the exception of Cindy's, whose was actually really good, and you should go look it up. What we want to get out of this is fact-based decision-making. We want to remove some of the bias so that we're acting more logically, really in concert with what is true. We want to be making decisions in concert with truth that is defensible. And instead, what we have is this kind of unspoken nest of biases that we sort of all know is at play, but none of us know what to do about it. So how has it changed your behavior? How has it changed my behavior, this knowledge of cognitive biases? Well, there's a meta pattern at play here also, which was pointed out by Marsha Linehan. The meta pattern is notice. That's step one. Notice. Describe. Make a plan. That's it. Notice, describe, make a plan. That's exactly what that retro was, that radical acceptance retro. Notice, describe, make a plan. We're going to do that again. But here we're not going to do it one time. We're going to do it every month until we develop some skill around thinking about cognitive bias and how it's affecting decision-making today. So what I suggest, use your community of practice. Get 3 or 4 people together. Set aside an hour once a month. And here's what you do. Here's what you do. You say, what is a decision that's going to be made in our domain this month? Who are the people who might make that decision? And then you choose, what are 2 or 3 cognitive biases that might come into play? And I'll give you an example in just a moment. And then you make an explicit strategy for how you might mitigate it. And then the next month, you do it again. You talk about how it went last month. And you do that 3 or 4 times, and so now your community of practice is actually practicing mitigation of cognitive biases that come up frequently. So if we agree that cognitive bias is important and that cognitive bias gets in the way of making fact-based decisions, why wouldn't we add it to the body of practice that we have? So here's an example. One of the places that cognitive bias comes in quite a lot, it's really easy, is what metrics should we track? There's information bias, which is like, I want all the metrics. There's availability bias. Well, we have, we can measure lines of code written and the dollars spent. We can divide those 2 things together, and now we know the value that we're getting by this is a real example, by the way. Dollars spent per lines of code. That's how we're going to measure value. That's a real example of availability bias. Then there's confirmation bias. This data said the thing that I always wanted to be true, and so I'm going to believe this data but not that data, right? So you can choose these 2 or 3 cognitive biases to focus on. It doesn't matter if they're the right ones. What matters is that you and your community of practice are getting together and you're thinking about how is cognitive bias going to hinder fact-based decision-making on this topic. And so then you make a little plan and you write it down and you share it with each other and you talk about it on Slack. And then you do it again next month. It's a really, really simple technique that leverages behaviors that you're already doing. It's a kind of a pre-mortem rather than a retrospective, but the idea that you get together, you name a thing that you want to learn about, you describe the thing, you make a plan, you see how it goes. That's a pattern that is probably already worked its way into your cadre of coworkers, and now you can leverage it to add this new skill. So that's tool number 2. Tool number 3, obvious but overlooked. One does not get buy-in in a single meeting. So I'm assuming that this term is really prevalent in Europe and in the UK. In the United States, it's like everywhere. Like, I've got buy-in, I've got buy-in. And here's this definition. It's kind of the best definition I've found, but it's still really inadequate, that it's the willing participation and enthusiastic followers. Like, that's about as vague as it gets. So I want to tell you how much I hate the word buy-in. I've been trying to get rid of it for a decade. There's no way that you can get rid of this word. You can't extract it. But nobody knows what it is. Everyone thinks that they have it because they're such good persuaders. Once we've got it, we forget about keeping it. We think that you get it once and you get to keep it forever. It disappeared when the wind changes, then you're like caught off guard and you're like, damn it. I didn't really write damn it first, I wrote another word. So here is the model that I use. that I developed a long time ago, probably back in the Adaptive Path days, and I've never presented it on a big stage until today. So this, I'm telling you, this is my best tool in my toolbox. Like, if you don't like this, I got nothing. Understanding, belief, advocacy, decision-making. You can use this to diagnose whether or not you have buy-in. So, for instance, I have heard people at conferences go, yeah, this lean startup stuff is so cool. Oh yeah, well, so what does lean startup mean to you? Oh, it's build, measure, learn, bro. And you're like, you don't have a freaking clue, but I love your enthusiasm. So the problem with this, and this happens all the time, yes, I've got buy-in to lean startup. Awesome, maybe we can work together. The problem is that then I tell them, like, it turns out lean startup doesn't mean you're fast or cheap. Lean startup means you actually have to run experiments the way that we heard earlier today, and that those experiments actually have to be really disciplined, and you actually have to write a hypothesis, and this kind of like sort of structure actually helps. And then they're like, no, man. I just want to spend no money. I want to make a shitty product, and then I want to win $1 billion. So what happens when you have belief but not understanding is that you have really fragile form of buy-in, and it could go away as soon as they learn the truth. Okay, this is logical. I see some nods. Thank you for nodding. I appreciate that. A little feedback helps. So let me tell you another story. I used to work at a company called Pivotal. There's a great Pivotal office here. I think there are some Pivotal people in the audience. I don't know where you are. Come on, Pivotal. Thank you. God, leaving me hanging, man. I only left 2 years ago, for God's sakes. Okay. So there was this one client of Pivotal. So the thing about Pivotal Labs is that they do pair programming. It's extreme programming. So you literally sit 2 developers, 1 CPU, 2 keyboards, and you pair all day. You don't have any meetings because you're sitting there coding while talking all day, every day. 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, you're pairing. So leaders will come through the Pivotal Labs offices, and it's like nirvana. And they leave, and they're like, this is the best thing I've ever seen. And then they're like, I'm going to write you $1 million check. And there was this one time, there's this very dramatic time, but it happens in smaller scale as well, where the team showed up. Like, they're like, we're going to send our people to you. And the team showed up, and literally within a week, they did a table flip and killed the contract. Why did that happen? It happened because they made a decision without understanding or belief. So they made a decision without understanding or belief. And you're like, whoops, we bought a thing we didn't really want. That's probably the most dramatic example I've seen of this. But you can see how we can find evidence, like if I had heard not just the leaders, but the software development leads of that team describing what Agile is, if I had heard their advocacy of this way of working, even conceptually, even if it was a little bit flawed and had imperfect understanding, that would have indicated to me that they really understood what they were buying and they were ready to do the thing. So we can use this you bad model, and by the way, I say it so that you can remember it. You bad. You'll never forget that. Oh, you bad. What is you bad? Understanding, belief, advocacy, decision making. If I have one without the other, I have a very fragile house. So now I can make some strategies. I can diagnose. Does this person really understand what it is that they're agreeing to? Okay, so I've got agreement, but do they understand it? Okay, they don't quite understand it, so I know that sometime in the next, let's say, month, I'm going to have to find a way to help them understand. So now I can diagnose and I can make an explicit strategy to help them understand what it is, right, that they need to know in order to really be a strong advocate, an informed advocate, so that their decisions don't get unmade next week or next month. So UBAT has been really, really helpful to me. Here's the one screen if you wanted to take a picture of it. This would be the one. Do they understand it? Do they believe in it? Can I hear them eloquently and accurately telling the story of it? That means they're putting some social capital on the line in order to advance the concept. And then are they making decisions in support of it? So what this is a model for understanding the truth about how people perceive the ideas that you're bringing to them. I want you to be effective at work. I want to be effective at work. So part of what we have to do is know truly, do we actually have agreement that's durable, that people are going to support this idea out in the world? So that's our third tool. I've already talked about all these things. So what I've done here is I have given you 3 tools for uncovering, accepting, and acting on what's true so that we can be more effective at work. The first one was radical acceptance, where you run a retro one time around a specific thing that's kind of got you agitated. So what you have to do is notice that you're agitated, describe the situation that has come before, and make a concrete plan for moving forward. That's the first one. Second one, Cognitive Bias Salon Monthly with someone in your cohort, 2 or 3 other people that you can have a conversation with, and begin using cognitive bias as a tool for improving the fact basis of decision-making around you. And the final one kind of goes more broadly. This goes from very personal to a little bit around you to very broad, is use you bad, as a diagnostic tool to understand the support that you have. Okay, so to close. It is a really rough time in the United States. I apologize for that. John Milton, I was an English major, so that's why some of these quotes are literary. John Milton said, long and hard. Long is the way and hard that out of hell leads up to light. So even if things are challenging for you today, in whatever way, you actually can walk that path to a better place. But it means that you have to face the truth. And we can do that together. And so to close, I want to thank you, UK, for sharing John Oliver with us. Because if it wasn't for him, I might cry.